Good morning and welcome to the ETFO Provincial Office. In the spirit of truth and reconciliation, the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario acknowledges that we are gathered today on the customary and traditional lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat. I'd now like to welcome ETFO President Karen Brown to the podium to share the highlights of ETFO's latest position paper entitled Promises Unfulfilled, Addressing the Special Education Crisis. President Brown will then introduce our other speakers this morning, and following their remarks, each of them will be available to answer your questions. Thank you. President Brown.
Thank you, Carla, and good morning, everyone. For over 2 decades, ETFO has been sounding the alarm about systemic failures in special education that continue to harm the very students we were meant to serve. In 2002, we released a position paper titled Fulfilling the Promise, Ensuring Success for Students with Special Needs, that outlined the issues created by policy and funding changes made by the Mike Harris government. The recommendations in that report were clear. We need to provide more funding, more resources, and more supports for students with disabilities. We also needed a more inclusive and accessible system that would allow all children, including those with disabilities, to reach their full potential. But here we are, 23 years later, and nothing has changed. In fact, it's worse. We are seeing the same issues that were clearly identified so many years ago, continue to fester and deepen. Despite all the research, recommendations, and countless voices of those working with students directly, the provincial government has failed to take meaningful actions to address the concerns. And so, today, we are facing a crisis in our classrooms. We are witnessing the negative impacts of conservative neglect of special education every single day. Educators are drowning in a system with insufficient resources and supports for student service for students. We see the devastating consequences of a lack of early intervention, children who are falling behind before they even have a chance to catch up. We hear from families who face barriers to accessing programs that can make all the difference for their children's future. And we witness the reality of increasing school violence because of unmet student needs. The Ford government has allowed the situation to deteriorate. This is just not an issue of funding, it is an issue of equity, of justice, and human dignity. All children, including those with disabilities, deserve a high-quality education. This is not a request, it is their right. But under the Conservatives, the right is being denied to far too many students with special education needs. The Education Act and the Ontario Human Rights Code require that children with disabilities receive appropriate services and supports to help them succeed. But what good are these rights when the government continues to fail to provide the necessary resources and supports to students, educators, education workers, to make that education a reality? In the report ETFO is releasing today, you will find 27 recommendations to guide the Ministry of Education in addressing this crisis, including indexing special education funding to inflation and updating data in an improved funding formula to help close the gaps between the existing programs and the needed supports. Here to explain these recommendations is Ricardo Trajan, a political economist and senior researcher with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Ricardo?
Good morning, everybody. No matter how we look at it, education funding in Ontario is highly inadequate. If we look at an year-over-year basis, education funding is not keeping up with inflation, it's not keeping up with enrollment growth. This year, the schools were asked to make do with $1,500 less per student compared to what they received in 2018. If we look at the way we allocate funding, the funding formula misses the target in a number of ways. Long story short, there's a lot of guess estimate. There's a lot of neglect, or the fact that so much of the costs of running schools are fixed costs and that per student funding does not quite meet the needs When you look at special education in particular, we see that 87% of all the money that is allocated for special education is based either on general enrollment or on a poor quality statistical model. Only 13% of the funding is actually allocated based on known and assessed needs. If we looked at our infrastructure, the Ontario government admits to $17 billion in a school repair deficit. And that is probably an underestimation of the real condition on the ground. If we look at funding to deal with crisis, be it COVID, be it the rise of racism, be it violence in our schools, the school funding is not deployed fast enough and it's not flexible enough to allow boards and schools to deal with this crisis in the way that they need. Especially in a context where the school board reserves have been depleted because boards have to fix the roof and address day-to-day problems that would have been funded should we have had a better funding formula. So these all sound like big numbers, but what they hide on the day-to-day is that our schools are about providing children the supports they need to become their better selves. It is about giving educators the supports that they need to be able to help the children to achieve their better selves. It's about telling the parents that they're not alone, that they can count on schools to bring their kids to that level. And the Ontario government, it's failing. It's failing, and it's failing miserably at that task right now. So in the report, we dive into these numbers, and what we realize is that the allocation, the special education funding, what it provides in real concrete terms is anything between an hour and 2.5 hours of dedicated support to a student with special education needs. 1 to 2.5 hours in a school week of 25 hours. That's less than 10%. And that's best case scenario. We know that in practice, that's not how funding is allocated. We know that in practice, what is happening is that principals and school boards are being asked to move money around. They're literally robbing Peter to pay Paul every single day, every school year. So that can only be addressed with changing the way we fund in schools. And then the report gets to it, and what we're proposing as a way to change funding and to fix the funding is a 4-step approach. The first one, obviously, would be to index funding to inflation and to simply increase the levels of funding. That's something that can be done immediately and that would have a very concrete impact on the lives of children starting next year. But that wouldn't be enough. That wouldn't be nearly enough. So the second step would be to fix that education, that statistical model on which so much of the funding for special education is determined. These are very detailed technical discussions. I won't get into it, but there are ways of using better data. There are ways of using more of the administrative data that we have available and more up-to-date data to improve that statistical model. But the ultimate goal would be then to address the waiting lists and start assessing kids so that we can fund based on needs and not funding based on estimates. So let me just finish by saying this. When we look at this closely, when you take the numbers apart, when you ask principals what they're actually doing on a day-to-day basis, what we realize is that Ontario is not funding special education. What we're doing is allocating somewhat arbitrarily sums of money to school boards and asking them to ration it, asking them to spread it and give everyone a little bit. So we're not funding special education in Ontario. We are rationing somewhat arbitrarily determined amounts and hoping that they will get students the support they need, but as other chapters in the study has shown very clearly, it doesn't. Thank you.
So thank you, Ricardo, for sharing your expertise on the funding structures and challenges special education faces in Ontario. Jennifer Pinder, a special education resource teacher with the Waterloo Region District School Board and ETFO member, brings a wealth of experience and insight to this discussion. Throughout her career, Jennifer has worked extensively with students with special education needs, including teaching in a specialized alternative continuum of education class and as a development support teacher for 25 schools. Additionally, in her past role as a social emotional learning consultant, she provided guidance and resources to all 107 schools within her school board. Jennifer?
Thank you, President Brown. Good morning. Hello. In the next few minutes, I'd like to share with you what I think all parents and caregivers deserve to know, what students understand, yet the ministry continues to ignore, and my hope for my colleagues in education and the future of education. So let's start by getting real clear. Student behavior and student needs is not at the foundation of this crisis. Government neglect and underfunding absolutely is. The complex needs of students continues to increase while the resources available to support them well are almost non-existent. As a teacher, I am far too familiar with what it's like to evacuate a class due to physical and/or emotional violence. And so are students. Everyone in a school building is currently experiencing the effects of the severity and the normalization of violence and high levels of stress. The lack of special education funding in Ontario affects every single student, whether they know it or not. Parents and caregivers, you deserve to know what your child is experiencing when you send them to school every day. And if you already know this, if this is familiar information to you, I acknowledge the toll it is likely taking on your child and on you and on your family. As an elementary school teacher, I can tell you two key concepts that grade 1 students understand, yet unfortunately, the education system they are in does not reflect it, nor do the people who fund it demonstrate these concepts. The first concept is that my job as a teacher is to make sure everyone is safe and everyone is learning. You see, we don't learn unless we feel safe and we feel like we belong. And once we feel safe and we belong, we can learn. And learning looks different for lots of people because all brains learn differently. And that's great. And stress brains don't learn so well. So first, safety and predictability, and then we can do our best learning. The second concept that kids understand is that everybody gets what they need in order to feel successful and be successful. And so for one student, what that might look like is writing a beautiful paragraph. And for another student, it might look like getting their lunch from their backpack by themselves for the very first time. Both those students deserve the resources to support that success. We should have high expectations based on an understanding of a student's learning profile, aligned with trained professionals and resources and spaces so that every student has what they need in order to succeed. This requires early intervention, timely access to assessment, and various placement and support options to meet students' diverse needs. Implementing these two key fundamental concepts that kids understand is currently impossible due to the lack of funding. Safety is essential for learning, and everybody gets what they need in order to be successful. Kids get that. However, the ministry clearly doesn't. Instead of recognizing the need for implementing these fundamental concepts, instead of attending to previously made recommendations, the ministry is spending time feeding us breadcrumbs in education and then telling us it's dinner. It's performative nonsense, and it's a cover-up campaign to save money in which children are negatively impacted. Your children, our children, they deserve better. You will hear folks say inclusion without support is abandonment. And that is precisely what is happening in classrooms across Ontario. Educators see it every day. To my colleagues in education, I see you working so hard, and I want you to know that our work matters. But I also want you to know you are not solely responsible for propping up an underfunded system. I know you want to do more for students, but you are not given the time, the space, nor the resources to do so, and I hope you know that. Hope is a fascinating feeling and cognitive process, and if I'm honest, my hope has shifted over time. I no longer hope that if the ministry simply knew better, it would do better. That time has passed. No longer can we let the limitations of this ongoing lack of funding define the value and the worth of children in Ontario. Here is where my hope lies though now, in this policy paper's clear and thoughtful recommendations, in the continued dialogue and action amongst stakeholders, and I hope we continue to advocate for our students so that everybody has what they need in order to be successful for who they are and to be safe and to learn. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's not just educators who feel the impact. Families face barriers to accessing essential community programs, and many watch their children struggle in a system that is failing them at every turn. Kate Dudley-Log, Vice President of Community Outreach at the Ontario Autism Coalition, joins us to share a community perspective. Kate?
Good morning, and thank you to ETFO for putting this important piece of work together and inviting the Ontario Autism Coalition to participate in today's press conference. As many of you here are likely aware, the OAC has been very concerned with systemic issues that have placed special education under significant strain for many years now. Repeated policy failures have left our most vulnerable students faltering under an extreme lack of resources and funding. If we are being honest, this has become more of a crisis than a strain. Students with special education needs are falling through the cracks at alarming rates, and in many cases are simply not accessing education at all. The OAC has a large membership of over 26,000. Our community is very engaged, and we hear stories daily about the shortcomings and inabilities students face when trying to access spec ed programming in Ontario that is safe and meaningful. We've brought numerous stories to Queen's Park and to the media to highlight a system that is not only failing students with disabilities, but is often dangerous to these students. Children with disabilities eloping school property, being excluded daily, and neglect that has gone so far that tragically a student with complex disabilities died last year after being left alone in a classroom for hours. This past year, the OAC embarked on a survey asking families of students with disabilities pertinent questions about their kids' experience during the 2023-2024 school year. The results were distressing, and they track with everything that ETFO is addressing in this report here today. Some of the data we collected showed that half of families do not feel that their children are actually safe at school or are receiving a meaningful education. And perhaps the largest example of the lack of supports is the rising level of exclusions that are faced by students with disabilities. 6% of families report that their children experienced full exclusion during the 2023-24 school year. The primary reason they were given was that the school did not have the needed resources to keep the student safe and supported. It is also becoming normalized that students with disabilities do not attend school full-time, with 19% of families reporting that their kids are on a modified schedule, the majority of whom are only at school for 1 to 3 hours a day. Again, the most cited reason being that the school lacked the resources to keep the children. Every year, more school boards are announcing cuts to their special education classrooms that they offer, with some boards moving to what's called a full inclusion model. Most recently, this is being proposed at the Ottawa Carleton District School Board, where they are recommending that 39 special education classrooms be cut. While the OAC believes that inclusion is absolutely in the best interest of many students when proper supports are in place, it is clear that those supports do not exist due to the lack of commitment and funding from the Ministry of Education. As ETFO states in this report, the inclusion model is not working. Not only are smaller, quieter classrooms necessary for some students with the most complex needs, but the supports simply are not there in mainstream classrooms to foster success for those students who could actually benefit from integration. And this needs to change. In closing, the OAC stands firmly with educators who are really doing the best they can with what little resources they're being given. Make no mistake, the resource shortages and systemic gaps that undermine special education in Ontario are not just problematic for disabled students who have a right to a fulsome, needs-based education, but also to educators and to every other student in our mainstream classrooms. We support ETFO's recommendations as actions that must be taken in order to fix our fundamentally broken special education system. Ontario must do better.
Thank you, Kate. Our final speaker this morning is Joanna Conrad, a mother of 3 children, one of whom has special needs, and an advisory member of the Greater Essex County District School Board's Special Education Advisory Committee, SEAC, representing Up About Down, a local organization that supports families who have a loved one with Down syndrome. Joanna?
When my daughter was born 10 years ago, she was the first person with Down syndrome I'd ever met. I had less than 24 hours of pure joy before fear took over. Fear of the unknown, of what her future would look like, of how the world would treat her. Although a diagnosis cannot predict the depth of love a parent has for their child, a diagnosis does matter. It is the key to accessing the right supports, whether for speech and language, reading, writing, or math. It allows educators to understand a child's needs and provide the interventions necessary for success. Yet, we are moving in the wrong direction. The board and the ministry have shifted away from formally identifying students, opting instead for tiered supports. That means fewer students will be recognized as needing special education, but the reality is that the number of students who actually need support is not decreasing, it's increasing. The numbers are being buried, but the struggle remains. So my journey as a mother quickly became a crash course in advocacy, a roller coaster ride of hope and heartbreak. And sadly, the most terrifying drops have been in the world of education. When my daughter started school, I learned the hard truth. The system wasn't built for her. Navigating it required strategy, persistence, and a fight I wasn't prepared for, but one I couldn't walk away from. There was a moment when I realized just how little value was placed on my daughter's education. And she's not alone. Across schools, students with disabilities are missing critical days of learning, not because they're sick, but because there aren't enough staff or supports in place to meet their needs. The best way I can describe this experience is to ask you to imagine having a terminal illness and being denied treatment. The helplessness, the panic, the knowledge that time is slipping away. That's what it feels like to watch your child lose years of learning. Knowing that the system is failing them and knowing that the people with the power to change it are simply not doing enough. And let's be clear, this isn't about blaming teachers. Teachers are overworked, under-supported, and drowning in impossible expectations. Special education funding is slashed, staff are burnt out, and students are slipping through the cracks. Decisions are being made behind closed doors without transparency, without logic, and without consulting the families they impact. Specialized programs that provide a critical bridge between inclusive classrooms and specialized settings are being cut. Assessments are delayed for years. IEPs cannot be followed. Special education is being watered down into consultative services, which is really just a fancy way of saying teachers are given more responsibilities with fewer resources. How does that help anyone? If those in power had a child with a disability, I guarantee they would take a much closer look at funding, or lack thereof. Because this isn't just about students with disabilities. Underfunding special education affects every child in a classroom. When supports aren't in place, learning suffers, teachers burn out, the whole system breaks down, and we're watching it happen in real time. And this is also not just an educational issue, it's a societal one. We can choose to invest in students now, or we can pay the price later when the same students, unsupported and unprepared, become adults left behind by society. When my daughter was born, I made her a promise. That promise has turned into a mission, not just for her, but for every child whose parents don't know how to fight or don't even realize that they have to. I want those parents to know that I see you, I hear you, and I'm fighting for your child too. Because our children, they deserve better. And I will not stop fighting until they get it. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. Supporting children with disabilities in elementary school is essential for the economic and social health of Ontario. Yet the reality in our schools tells a different story. The right to an education that enables every child to reach their full potential is not just a promise, it is the law. But this government has failed to uphold the law, systemically failing students, educators, education workers, and families. Our comprehensive Promise Unfilled position paper, available for download at etfo.ca, explores the history of special education in Ontario, the challenges we face today, and the concrete steps the provincial government must take to finally deliver on the promise of an education system that serves all students, including those with disabilities. The Ford government must do better, and we won't stop until they do. Thank you. At this time, we are open for questions.
Really quickly, obviously this is very involved.
And you touched upon a number of different points. I'm just curious, in terms of the system and the issues with the system itself from the Ford government down that you're spelling out. It claims that there's more investment than ever this specific year. There's more money, there's more special ed teachers. I'm just curious where the gap is then if they're making this claim, and if that money is not necessarily getting to you, or if those hires aren't necessarily in the right places, where is the difference?
So maybe I'll start, and then maybe Ricardo can jump in. From our experience, the indexing is a key issue. It's not keeping up with inflation. So the funding is not coming in. This year, ETFO actually had to negotiate, for example, over 400 positions for specialized teachers to help students who had a disability with reading, assessing reading in regards to the right to read report. And that was something that fundamentally the government should provide for every student. It's not something we should have to negotiate. And what we're finding out right now, that there's still so many students who are failing that gap, that aren't reaching those benchmarks at the end of the school year. Where is the money that's going to be allocated for those students? So the government says one thing, but that was a prime example. We shouldn't be negotiating that. That every child, those children, have a right to have those teachers who are there to support them, and that's part of the gap. And so until we push, that's one example in regards to it. So there's not the proper funding models. The government says one thing, actually does another. The indexing. I'll let Ricardo, then I'll come in with two other points.
So as a researcher, as a public policy analyst, someone who works in a think tank that has in-depth knowledge of the education funding formula in Ontario, the past years have been extremely frustrating because we would like to have a conversation about how to improve the funding formula, recognizing some of the limits on the resource side, some of the limits on the expenditure side, what our debt looks like, what are the macroeconomic context is. Still, we would like to have that conversation, but yet we never get to it because this government has insisted on very disingenuously messaging. And my work has become, at times, simply to redo the math and say, no, that's not how math works. We all go to the grocery store and our bills in the grocery store gets higher every year. It doesn't mean we're eating more. It doesn't mean we're starting to splurge money in superfluous spending. It just means that inflation is making everything more expensive, and now we have to spend more on it. And if we have additional children, guess what? Our food bills continue to grow because now we have another mouth to feed. And so that's one of the ways that this government has miscommunicated the funding for education. It's not taking into account inflation and enrollment growth, but there are other things that have happened kind of deep into the education formula. So if we go back to 2018, 2019, the debates about class sizes, for example, right? There has been some fundamental changes that were built in the education formula then, increasing class sizes, introducing mandatory online learning for secondary education, which over time that adds up quite a bit in terms of how much staff we have at schools. So one of our studies estimates that we have today 5,000 fewer educators in our system that we would have had if we hadn't introduced those changes in 2018, 2019. With the special education funding in particular, what we do here is to fund based on estimates. Estimates that sometimes use 2006 data, whereas 2016 data is available, 2021 data is available, where other data sets are available that are telling us that those original data sets are missing a big part of the picture. And yet, even if we're use a statistical model, which we think is not the best way to go forward, going forward, it's best to assess than estimate. But even if you were to use a statistical model, there's data available to make sure that that model that you're using more directly reflects the reality of your children so that you can fund more adequately. And that's not happening also. So I stop it there, but there's a lot of messaging coming out from this government that unfortunately is quite disingenuous. It's very inaccurate, and it has prevented us, myself, other think tanks, other research institutes, my colleagues in academia, to engage in a really substantive conversation about how to fund education, which is the conversation we should be having.
And I want to highlight, you can go to the ETFO website at buildingbetterschools.ca, and you'll be able to see the amount of funding each school has lost since 2018, so the reduction in regards to the amount of money that's been taken away from a school system in general. I want to also highlight that the People for Education also did a report. Ricardo talked about data and facts. There's over 37,000 children waiting for assessment for special education or IPRC. So we're not making up the numbers. There's an enormous wait list for students to get support, and for those who have the money, they're able to achieve private assessments and move ahead of others. So then we look at inequities in regards to marginalized communities, racialized, indigenous communities. Those are factors that are intersectional that play here. So one of the things that you've heard clearly is the data. We have the data to support what we're seeing in the classroom, and the assessment, as Ricardo mentioned, based on needs, not estimates. The needs are increasing. The number of children who are being identified with exceptionalities are far outnumbering the numbers that the Ford government is using. We're seeing enormous numbers within the classrooms.
Thanks. And just keeping on the funding issue, have you costed these recommendations, or at least the sort of bigger ticket items, as to how much funding you would need from the government?
I don't have a costing number. Ricardo might have some details. And you really can't put a number on human rights and equity. Our children, and that's one of the things I want to highlight, that education and special education investing is not an expense, it's an investment. And that's we're seeing governments and school boards doing it. they're seeing it as an expense, and they're closing classrooms. So where you're looking at Ontario Northeast, you're looking at Peel, you're looking at Greater Essex, and we're hearing about Ottawa, they're seeing it as an expense to invest, provide the students that they need, as opposed to an investment. So we're saying students need this. We need a coat. It's cold. We need to provide it so that they can thrive. They have the same opportunities of every other student in Ontario. But I'll have Carlo give you some more parts notes.
Karen's absolutely right that you can't put a cost on fulfilling human rights, but I do try, and that's my job. and we did try with this report in particular. But one thing that it's difficult with special education is that we just don't know. We just don't have the data, right? When we moved back in the 1990s, when we moved late 1990s, early 2000s, when we moved from funding based on assessed needs to estimated needs, we stop assessing, we stop having a really good understanding of what's happening on the ground. And that's one of the most disconcerting impacts of the funding formula when it comes to special education. It's not only that it doesn't provide the amount that is required based on what we heard here and based on what we hear from teachers, is that it also doesn't even give us the tools to assess funded, because we simply do not know. So unfortunately, the direct answer to the question is that we don't have cost estimates. We can talk about increasing this amount or increasing that amount and how much it would cost to index to inflation and whatnot. But what we would really need in terms of improving funding, increasing accountability, and fixing the formula going forward is to have a major effort on clearing the assessment backlog. That would give us so much more information to start having a very serious and much needed conversation about what kinds of levels of funding we would need.
I also just wanted to ask a little bit about the closing of special ed classrooms. You mentioned Ottawa, Peel. What does that look like for students when that happens?
Well, we're seeing, not just in Ottawa, but in other school boards, you mentioned Peel. Peel was making more of a full, gradual phase out of their spec ed classrooms over a span of years. That's what's being suggested in Ottawa as well, where they grandfather in the families that are the students that are currently in those classes, but stop bringing in any new classes, any new students to those classes. And also in answer to your question about funding, I would say that, and it has been noted here, the needs in classrooms are becoming way more complex. And one of the things that us from the Ontario Autism Coalition are trying to draw a little bit of a comparison to, and there is testimonial in ETFO's report today about specifically in the last 5 years seeing the needs increase. Well, what happened 5 years ago was the Ford government destroyed the Ontario Autism Program, which, to be clear, always had a wait list, but it was more manageable between 1 and 2.5 years. Now they're at 5 to 7 years. So all of those children, and there are thousands of them, we're up to somewhere between 60 and 70,000 children in Ontario, are now being filtered into the school system having not received any clinical supports, not having the opportunity to develop the skills that would make them a little bit more able to be successful, comfortable, safe in a classroom. And I think it's important to highlight how big of an effect that is probably happening in our classes. And the fact that, to your question about the specialized classrooms being shut down, most students are eventually going to find themselves in mainstream classrooms. As we know, the EAs that are there to support them are in, the shortage is devastating at this point. And every year we're getting less and less. And so what as I spoke about in my remarks earlier, modified schedules. It's becoming normalized. Families being told that their kids cannot be supported the full day. And this is clearly not right. It's a human rights issue. These children have a right to be at school the whole day, not for 2 hours. But schools have their hands tied. What are they going to do? They can't have the kids be there and not be safe in the classroom. So unfortunately, again, it's becoming normalized and it's just not right.
I think Jen's gonna add something.
Hi, I'm going to address both questions. The funding question, just as a specific example, if you go to Building Better Schools, the school that I'm currently a special education resource teacher in, it would indicate that the cuts have been $1 million to the students I see every day, just to give you a specific amount of funding. With regards to what does that look like, sound like, and feel like, can you tell I'm an elementary teacher? Yeah, okay, great. What does it look like, sound like, and feel like for students when there are less alternative spaces for them? I'm going to tell you a brief story about what it was like when I was teaching in an alternative continuum of education classroom. What we would do at the time when we had more funding is that parents, caregivers, and guardians would be able to come in and observe within our classroom ahead of time before they made a decision of whether they wanted their child to stay in a grade level classroom or be in an alternative classroom. And I remember having parents come, a mother and a father, and mom wore on her face that she looked real pleased and that this seemed like a real great fit. And dad wore on his face an expression I wasn't sure what it was. And so when I met with them, I said, can you tell me a little bit more of where you're at? I said that to dad. And with tears in his eyes, he said, I thought that a class like this would be putting my kid in a corner. And instead I see that you put them on a pedestal. And that moment will always stand out to me because I think we create these stories about what we think is happening in schools and in education, but until we experience it, and I experience it Monday through Friday, it's very different. And so that experience for that parent was, this is what my student needs, my child needs in order to be successful for who they are. And so when those options aren't available to people, when there are big spaces like the room of us, if we were all chatting, that would be really overstimulating and dysregulating for certain kids. Not because they're not working hard, they're working tremendously hard. It's just that the places aren't available, the resources aren't available to support them with what they need. So what it looks like when kids don't have what they need, it looks like everybody's losing out. Thank you.
I think Joanna
Hi,
wanted to make one.
it's Will Paul from School Magazine. I've got a couple of questions. One of them has to do with the graph that you have in your report, which indicates that IEPs are very rapidly rising over the past few years, and the actual identification of kids and their needs is dropping. And that suggests to me, and I'd like your comment on it, is whether or not we're actually hiding these kids. They're sort of hiding behind a promise of IEPs, but actually not being identified, which would put the board in a position of having to do something directly with these kids. Can you comment about that?
I'll start off with the IEPs, as you say. There's a whole system of informal IEPs where because of the wait list, the time is so long to get children, to get supports, they're creating informal processes. And so the boards are not, I wouldn't say they're not identifying students, it's just taking a lot longer, and they're doing different ways of trying to provide supports. And that's where we're not actually getting the data. So by the time, let's say, they're not identifying students before grade 3. So by the time it's not until grade 6, because the wait list is 2-3 years long, that actually that process begins. So you're seeing there's a delay in it. So it's not necessarily the numbers are going down. I just think it's taking a lot longer before the children, and then children move and things happen within the system. But we've been highlighting that we need more resources so students can be identified earlier. But once they're identified, then it's just a wait list. There isn't the supports. So even if we were identifying all of them right away, there are not enough resource teachers, there's not enough supports to meet those needs of those particular students. And that's why we're seeing some of the violence that's happening in the classroom. It's because of unmet needs. Students are feeling frustrated, aren't able to self-regulate. We used to have educational assistants or child and youth workers who could take the students out, work with a smaller group. That's not there. They're troubleshooting because of that. So it's really looking at the formula and reinvestment, because even if we were identifying, We do not have enough resource teachers. We do know with the Ontario Teachers Federation at the government, there was part of the ministerial portfolio that we understand. They say there's going to be a shortage in teachers in the next 2 years in 2027. We're saying there's a shortage right now. So we have a rise in students, but we're educators there to meet their needs. And we need supports for those educators who want to work within special education. They need the training and the supports. We don't need curriculum being changed on a whim and announced and not getting supports that students get the best needs, the best supports that they need. And it was mentioned earlier, when we invest in special education, all the students in the classroom benefit from it because every child is being interrupted when you're having to close a classroom, right? When there's a shutdown in the classroom, if there's a student, there's an outbreak, everyone is impacted by the noise or the violence. So it is really important that this investment is not just for special needs students, it's an investment for everyone, so everyone is learning at an equitable level. I believe Joanna had wanted to add something. Did you want to add?
Sure, thank you. I just wanted to add to the question about what's happening to the students when it comes to the cutting of the specialized programs. And I think it's important for all of us to step back and stop looking at, well, what do we think is happening, but maybe look at it from a perspective of what would happen to us if we were in a situation where we were unsupported, not provided with the resources that we need to do our best. And imagine being not prepared for what you're being expected to deliver and how you would feel. And oftentimes I think that would put us in a better place to understand what is actually happening to these students because there's so little, they don't know what's happening and they're going to their parents and they're saying, Mommy, Daddy, what can I expect to happen to me come September when I'm not able to go to that class anymore? Who's going to support me? Who is going to provide me with the assistance I need to get by, to read, write? Because now they're looking at it from a perspective of how they compare to their peers and what is happening to their self-esteem and what is happening in terms of how they view themselves and in relation to their peers and what those peers are thinking of them. As I'm sure you can recall, when you were younger, the reputation that you have and the way in which your peers think about you is everything to you at that time. So when you are in a position where you feel like you're inadequate because you can't do quote unquote just basic things like read and write, then of course you're going to be worried about what people are saying about you, the names that they're calling you, and I will ask you, would that make you want to go to school? Would that make you want to go to the workplace if you weren't prepared and you were expected to speak at a press conference and you didn't have anything with you, and yet you're being asked questions or you're being expected to deliver? No, you would probably hide, you would shy away, or perhaps you would take the alternative and maybe act out to draw attention to something other than your inadequacies or your inability to do something. And I think that that's really where we need to start, is to start looking at what are we doing when it comes to supporting the students that require it and supporting them in those environments, because we know that unfortunately there aren't enough supports and resources in place. And so even though we can say all day long that inclusion is great, yes, sure, but without the proper supports, we're simply abandoning these children. And again, what does that look like long term when they don't want to go to school, when they don't want to learn, and when they don't want to thrive, really? So thank you.
I was going to add to your question.
Thanks, yeah.
One common misconception is that once a child or once a student is assessed and is officially recognized that they need special education supports, that triggers some additional funding. That is simply not true. At the school level, at the board level, a certain amount of funding has already been received in the beginning of the year, and that amount has to be rationed for all the children who have special education needs. If halfway through the year, the number of kids that you are supporting increases from 10 to 20, that amount does not increase. Except if it's really high needs that have been identified, there are some very small envelopes that the board may be able to tap into, and that might trigger some additional funding, but those are fairly small amounts, right? So this is something it's important to understand. I don't want to in any way argue that boards or schools are, deliberately not assessing kids, but from a school board and from a school perspective, there's no incentive from a funding perspective to assess children. From this ministry perspective, at this point, There would also be irrelevant, because the way we fund, assessing more and getting a better sense of the needs would make it more clear and more transparent, the gap between funding and needs. And then to address an earlier question about the funding and how much cost you would add to the mix, if we move to a funding model based on needs, it would create some need to have in-year adjustments to the funding of schools. But that already exists within the Ministry of Education to a certain degree, and it already exists in other ministries and other things that provincial governments fund, that you have to adjust in year, and it's very doable. And we have the fiscal capacity and the fiscal and the resources to do that. But it is a big misconception, unfortunately, that assessing a kid triggers new funding, and it doesn't.
Can I just step back a little bit and just see what you might think about this suggestion, which is that we have government who's shown over and over again that they're not really interested in things like special ed, or for that matter, outdoor education, music, cultural activities. And we have a premier who said over and over again that education really should be about training to enter the workforce, more or less. So special ed doesn't necessarily fit into that model, and I wonder if you could comment on whether or not this is part of the thinking behind the government, the focus, the really logical focus.
What I will say is this government has focused on Ontario's open for business. It has worked with other unions to provide apprenticeship opportunities. We have, at least Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, did not have an opportunity to actually meet with the Minister of Education prior to a week before departing to talk about public education. They didn't have an education platform, so education is not a priority for this government. So when you talk about providing training for the workforce, some students in special education will not be going into the workforce. They will be supported for lifelong. And what we're seeing is this government is prioritizing cuts over compassion and really austerity over access. And we're talking about that access to quality education. So are we surprised? No. What we have been saying is that we want to be able to have those conversations to really put education at the forefront. It's a cornerstone of every society. And as we're talking here in regards to our report, it's an issue about equity and access for students with special needs. And what you're saying, that statement, is a failure to recognize the diversity of individuals within the province.
Hi, I have a few questions as well. Just first off, tied to the previous question. It seems you haven't seen the changes that you would have liked to in the past at least 7 years, if not more. You mentioned, a couple of decades, but I'm wondering the Ford government is back with a majority.
Mm-hmm.
How hopeful are you that you are going to see any change when it comes to special ed within the next 4 years?
Well, we're continuing to work with our partners. So it's not just the voice of ETFO, of our educators and our teachers, but it's the voice of community, the voice of parents. And so it's not just us, talking about increasing class size, as they would say, because we want to increase our staffing. We're sounding the alarm that education is at a critical point in Ontario, and especially when we look at special education. And we're hoping that they're going to really have a look at this paper, that it's not just there are facts behind it, there's research behind it, and if they are committed to Ontarians and wanting to improve the lives of Ontarians, that they really want to work with us. We are key stakeholders in education, and it's an opportunity to give them a fresh start. We have a new Minister of Education. We met with her. We're trying to give her an opportunity. This is an opportunity for them to change that legacy, to do something new, and to really engage with all the stakeholders in education. We're saying it's important. They might have dismissed it in the past. We're saying we cannot continue going in this direction. The wait list for students we should be ashamed in regards to that, and the resources. We're seeing more and more boards, pushing towards inclusion, but it's a cost-saving mechanism. Students are suffering. There are other ways to look at it. Let's speak to the experts in the field. Inclusion is great for some students, but not all students. And we're seeing that those impacts in the classrooms where those students are being failed by the system. I don't think that's the Ontario the Premier wants, and we want to work together. We all have the same vision for students who can thrive and be successful, and that's what we're here together to say, let's work with us. So that's our message, and especially with the Minister. It's a new Minister of Education. She has an opportunity to leave a legacy, to do something to make some changes where her predecessor didn't.
Thanks. And I'm wondering when it comes to special education policy, just your thoughts on, do you think it would be helpful to have any sort of, standardization across the province? And, maybe things like the use of sensory rooms or staffing or anything like that, do you think that would be helpful? So there aren't potentially differences between boards?
Yeah, I think there are some, and I don't have the specifics, but I'll answer that to the best of my ability. I think there are some things that would benefit students if there was some standardizing in regards to the funding and the amount of funding that they're going to get to support. But each student's exceptionality is unique, and within those exceptionalities, there are unique things. I think what boards want is the flexibility to resource their students based on their needs. So maybe, you don't, depending on the number of students within your board that might need a sensory room, that you have the flexibility to have that. You might have within your board a different demand. It might be looking at how students are identified with their exceptionalities. In the report, it talked about if you were in Toronto and being identified for MID, and if you were in, I can't remember another board, let's say it was Greater Essex, the threshold, the percentile is very different in order to get resources. So why is that? So there are some things that we can harmonize so it's more accessible to parents, because if I was that parent, I'd move to that board where if it's only 5 percentile where my child is going to get that support, where it has to be at the 7th percentile over here. So I think there are things we could look at, and I think those are part of the broader discussions. And we were asking for a committee, a sort of a panel to come together to look at special education, to review those policies. So that's where we can come together, the think tanks, the experts, and to put forth some of those conversations. Where are there things we can harmonize? Where do you need the flexibility? And that's why we need to come to the table, and that's why they need to be at the table.
Sorry, just final question. Something that Joanna had touched on as well, but whoever wants to speak to this, she mentioned about just the long-term impacts of, not having, and I'm wondering if any of you could kind of speak to what are those long-term impacts of students not having the resources today in school, in the early years. What does that mean down the line, 10, 15, 20 years, either for them, their families, kind of society as a whole?
Would anyone like to add, and I can finish? Yeah. Okay, so I'll let Joanna, and then I'll answer that at the end.
That's a great question, and it's twofold to answer the question previously asked about society, really, and the value of people who have disabilities and how we value them and their worth in terms of the workplace, right? So if we don't invest in children when they are young, in the elementary years, then what can we expect going forward into secondary and or post-secondary? Historically speaking, and the reason why I share that my daughter was the very first person I had met with Down syndrome was because I went to school without any children who had disabilities. Just up until not long ago, regional centers where institutions where children with disabilities were shipped off to learn, where we know atrocities occurred. These are places where we oftentimes kept these children. This is why people like myself went to school for many, many years without having to come into contact with anybody with a disability. And this is also why we are in a place where society doesn't necessarily hire many people with disabilities, because we don't see their value, we don't see their worth. And why is that? Because oftentimes they were not educated to be able to go into the workforce. So whereas you have students now who could go into the workforce and become contributing members of society, whether it be them working at the Metro, or working at a Tim Hortons, or working in a courthouse for that matter, they absolutely can contribute, but they have to be given the opportunity. So whereas before we were institutionalizing people with disabilities, of course, they're not deemed as being quote unquote valuable members of society when they're not able to contribute to the economy. But that's because they were never given the opportunity to learn how to read and write and to do all the things that they can absolutely do. But over time, as we've allowed students to go into mainstream school, to receive the education, to receive the supports that they can, where they're showing us what they're capable of, you are seeing people with disabilities, people with Down syndrome doing all different types of things and working in different capacities, becoming contributing members of society, but they have to be given the chance. So if we don't provide them with the opportunity to do so, we will never see the outcome. And unfortunately, we live in a society where we all want instant gratification. We want the here and now, right? This is the world of Ozempic, where nobody wants to put in the time to lose the weight by eating properly or dieting. We just want the quick magic pill to make things happen. And I understand that what we're asking for is also something that takes time, right? So the results that we're going to see by investing in students today is not necessarily something that we're going to see tomorrow. It might be something that we see 20 years from now, but absolutely, I think that the value is there and the worth is there. We just need to commit to it.
Thank you. And to end by answering your question, my background is in special education, speech, language, and autism. And when I started my teaching career, I was seconded to work at the Children's Mental Health Center. And at that time, we were doing home visits. So we were able to go into the homes and to meet the children and their parents before they came into the setting. And what was great about that is that you got an opportunity to see what was taking place in the home and how much parents tended to do things. It was kindergarten at the time, and one of the little boys, mom would dress him, put on his coat, his boots, his hat, the entire process. And when these children come into the system, when kids are there, we're able to help them become independent. So by the end of the year, little Stephen was putting on his own hat, his coat, was speaking, was ready to be integrated into a grade 1 program with some supports. So when we start early, we're able to meet the children where they are, help to develop their skills so they can become lifelong learners, so they can integrate into society. If we didn't have those interventions, and a lot of those interventions don't exist now, it might be grade 3 before that child is able to zip up their zipper independently because they haven't had the support to do that. And then it's what other skills in regards to communicating certain things to be a greeter or to work at somewhere. It's an investment now. It really takes off some of the things that we would see on our social systems in supporting these students who are not able to be developed into independent adults in whatever capacity. So by investing now, we can see where they can thrive, where their strengths and weaknesses are, develop those strengths so that they can be contributors in whatever area in society. And so by not doing those investments, and I know this Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation, they did a report a few years ago where they gave the numbers in regards to not special education, but an investment in education in general, the impacts when you're not having impacts on the social system, but the jail system, other systems where we're going to be paying for because we're not providing the supports for these students where they drop out of school, tune out of school, where if they have the supports to engage, support them through, community college, a trade, or something else. So as we know that the investments pay dividends over, and the investment in the ability to learn and engage in whatever capacity you can is fulfilling for any individual. If you know that you can accomplish something as a child, that stays with you as an adult. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
very much.